Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africafé. In this episode, we are discussing the depth and scope of migration and displacement as portrayed in contemporary cinematic, artistic, and cultural production. The reality is this: amidst a plethora of push and pull factors, from economic policies, conflict, climate change, and war, many Africans migrate, both within the continent and outside. Human flow is a social phenomenon that has existed since the dawn of civilization. Today, it profoundly shapes our political discourse. Here, we want to discuss it through the lens of African cinematographers across the continent to truly understand the depiction of this social, economic, and political phenomenon. To discuss this, I am joined by Valerie Orlando, professor of French and Francophone literatures in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Maryland, and author of New African Cinema. Valerie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My first question to you, Valerie, is a bit broad, but is one which I hope can set the tone for this episode. What is the function of African cinema in the 21st century if you were to compare it to African cinema in its beginning in the context of the post-colonial era? And tied to that, why is film so important for sociocultural and political messages in Africa, particularly in regards to the lives and experiences of migrants?
That's a really good question. And so I have to preface my answer, um, really in the context of how I teach African cinema, because it's a subject that's very interesting for my students here at the University of Maryland who come from a lot of different immigrant groups from Africa. Um, Excuse me, I'm right outside Washington, D.C., so we have a lot of, particularly West African, communities, Senegal, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, and then also a lot of North African, Maghrebi communities, Moroccans, and, Algerians. So, I am privileged in the sense that I get a lot of these students in my classes, and, although they were born here, they have this link, to Africa, but, what's interesting is a lot of them have not, been privileged to really understanding, I think, their parents' immigrant past. Yeah, I find a lot of times they're very, I don't wanna say ignorant, but, not aware of
Yeah.
their country's situations, like, I mean, if we take Cameroon, the social, political, context of Cameroon, even right now is just, completely, devastating, and I think a lot of these parents have not wanted to divulge these very sort of often violent histories to their children. So the children come to my classes to see what they can learn about African cinema with, certain what we call, idées reçues in French. There's not a really great English equivalent to that, but I preconceived ideas, I guess. So how I teach African cinema is very much for that kind of context. Um, I have to give my students a lot of colonial history so that they understand, how cinema has emerged as a way of uh, I guess as a means for filmmakers to comment on the past, but also to find ways to move forward. And one of the great filmmakers is the Senegalese Simbin Ousmane. I mean, he was very, very good over the course of his life to make the transitions from one decade to the next, commenting not only on progress that was happening or not in Senegal, but also um, what the colonial legacy meant, and so my publications and my on and my teaching are very much looking at sort of the filmmaker as a interlocutor for people who primarily are not literate or don't have the time to read a lot about their own country's contexts. And African film is very didactic in that there's always a message that has to be transmitted to audiences so that they come out of the theater with some kind of change, and I always tell my students African cinema is not Hollywood, it's not a cinema industry for entertainment. um, so that's I don't know if I even answered your question, but I mean, that is sort of the context of how I have to teach African cinema and discuss cinema in a sort of American context because my students come from, and not just immigrant heritage students, but, students, just American students who are,
Curious
here.
about the topic.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Um,
they have this curiosity, but they don't have the knowledge, historical, political, and social knowledge of Africa to understand the films and still until we start really unpacking them.
Yeah, it's truly when you get into the conversation, when you realize that there is this sort of absence in knowledge production about these kind of topics, which is why we thought it was important to cover this. And uh, I want to go back with you to the sort of very basic question of like if a student were to ask you in class, what is African cinema? I know that's a big and broad question. It's also
Mhm.
we don't want to look at the entire continent as one unit. But how would you define it? How can you distinguish between African cinema in terms of its structure and other kinds of cinema, not only in content but also maybe perhaps in industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question because, what is African cinema? And since I'm in a French department, people wanna put labels on it like Francophone African cinema, which, most of the films that I show in my classes don't have French in them, or the French that's used is because, there are a few French words, for example, in Darija, so they come up. Um, so the position of the continent is important to understand, I think. And also, yeah, you don't want to create this sort of blanket definition of African cinema for the entire continent. Every country is very unique. But I will say the one thing that sort of is a commonality is that, as one Moroccan filmmaker told me, "We do not make films," I'm translating from French, "We do not make films for luxury, we make them to tell a story," or I mean, tell a story in the sense of tell the audiences something very important that needs to be understood. Um, and I think that is the what sets African cinema apart. Even recent films, the Arab cinema, I just went to it's called the Arab Sites Cinema Film Festival, and it happens every year here, and so there are films from all over the Arab world, and Morocco is usually included in there, and they had the latest film of, Mariam Touzani, and she's talking about very important, I think, things in the context of women's issues in Morocco or, and just sort of the new challenges that women face. She's known for that, so every one of her films engages with that kind of, polemic, and I think that's what we have to take away from African cinema. Even the first films, Paul Vieira did, Paulin Vieira did, Afrique sur scène, which came out in 1955, and that's considered, the first African film made by an African filmmaker, um, and in sort of the post-colonial vein, and even that film, although it was shot in Paris in black and white,
Yeah.
it's still telling, a didactic narrative about, um Black Africans and the challenges they faced in the '50s living in France, you know? So,
And why
that's the con
why wasn't this film, why weren't they able to were they able to film it in Africa? Why was it filmed in Paris?
well, there that has a lot to do with, the, laws set up by the colonial colonial state because the colonial, master at the time, certainly in, Cameroon and Senegal and in sub-Saharan Africa, there were laws, I forget the exact title of it, but it was a law that Africans could not make films, on the continent, during colonial times, and why? Because the French viewed film as very, very, scary. I mean, because it's a media form that can change people's, views of things, certainly colonialism, even if you're illiterate, and this was something that Simbin was dedicated to right at the beginning of, well, in the early '60s, taking film to the villages and showing people who were primarily illiterate and cut off from, urban centers, what they needed to know kind of idea, and, so that's I mean, film was looked at as a media form that was very dangerous, even more so than writing because, an author can only really, even have a discourse with those who can read him or her, so whereas a filmmaker, can reach a larger audience, and so that's the power of media, and even in the post-colonial context, you see post-colonial governments very, very afraid of film. I mean, Simbin was censored by, Senghor.
Mhm.
um, you have filmmaking in Algeria that basically shut down, during the Civil War, because also and filmmakers who wanted to make controversial films about that Civil War are still, having to do a sort of cloak and dagger kind of filming, practice in order to get the truth, out. Um, so I think that too is a commonality, across the continent. Even Nollywood films, if you look at them, they're very, they're very they can be very controversial, they can be very activist, um, and I think, in the true sense of what Jean-Paul Sartre said, that these people are engagés. They're engaged in civic disobedience and
Mhm.
also, getting the truth out to audiences.
Yeah. One of the things that I was hoping to shed lights on is this truth in regards to the subject of migration. We understand the duality of migration. On the one hand, it benefits the host countries by filling labor needs and also benefits countries of origin via remittances. But also, on the other hand, migration, especially clandestine migration from Africa to Europe, is an increasingly and highly politicized subject. It evokes desperation, fear for a lot of people, and hope and resilience for others. So, you mentioned the importance of story. We often hear that a single story is always dangerous. Could you tell us some of the stories that African cinema has shed lights on and that you think captures this sort of complexity and duality?
Yeah, well, I try, in my courses to give students an idea of sort of the history of African filmmaking, but also, the different subjects that are important depending on the sort of socio-political environments that we have, you know,
Mhm.
whenever I'm teaching. I mean, I've been teaching for 35 years, so of course, the way I've taught African cinema, even in the last 15 years, has evolved depending on what the, context of the world is, really.
Yeah.
Um, and right now, yes, I think immigration and immigrant stories are very, very, prevalent not only in African filmmaking, but in African writing too. I mean, I teach courses on, Francophone African writing, and immigration is probably the number 1, um, the number 1 subject. And it's interesting because this recent course that I've taught on immigration in African cinema, I tried to, of course, get out of the sort of Francophone label, the Francophone former colonized French colonized countries, to branch out into other areas, and, I found interesting films from Angola, um, where else? I'm looking at my list, and also from Nigeria, um, and, there have been some very good films, for example, Io Capitano, which was made, in Italian, actually, Italian and the indigenous languages of several, of, this of several Africans that the story focuses on. And what's interesting about the stories from Sub-Saharan Africa is the routes that people take across across the
Migration routes.
continent to get to the north, and often, unfortunately, they get stuck in North Africa. Um, and they reveal a lot of, interesting dynamics. For example, racism against them in North Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, and Syria. Um, and also just sort of the hopelessness of, the what I wanna say, the journey.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, the journey, to get to that beach, to look over to Europe is always incredibly arduous, but once they make it, they're so close, yet in most of these films, and I have, I don't know, 15 films, they fail. They fail in that last 15 miles. What is, like, I don't know, 10 kilometers, 15, I mean, how many kilometers are from Tangiers to Spain, I mean, it's very, very minuscule distance, but it's that distance that's sort of the ending point for most of their journeys, and so, I mean, in the context of these films, you see the same scenario playing out. It's very interesting, whether the film is from Senegal or Angola or, Sierra Leone, it's the same scenario. We get there and we can't get across. Now, in the Algerian context or the Moroccan context, because there have been films also on this immigrant journey, across the Mediterranean, I mean, the scenario, of course, starts on the beach, um, but unfortunately, the destitution and just, like, the lack of hope, that is evoked in these films, I think is the most, the part of it that I find the most tragic.
Yeah.
And they're not like I said, they don't have happy endings, and I think, for American students, that's a really hard thing to swallow because we're so informed by Hollywood and having these nice endings, where, oh, they finally make it across or whatever, but, that is not at all the situation of these films. Um,
Could
um
you maybe share some of the examples that you have with us to go and discover them alongside with our audience?
Yeah, yeah, let me see, for example, Imma have to get my glasses on. Well, I the one that really stands out is La Pirogue, so it's the title's in French, I think it's called The Boat, in English by Moussa Touré, which came out, in 2012, but it's still a very, it was one of the first films, I think, to really tackle this question of how do you get across that sea to get to Europe. And it also focuses on questions around these are Senegalese, right? Getting in this little tiny boat and trying to go across to get to Spain and France, the southern Europe. And so the question comes up though, why should you go? Because there are some contexts where these young men, and it's always young men, there's rarely women who sometimes there's one woman, it's interesting. There's one woman in the boat. I've noticed
Yeah.
that this is a repeating leitmotif. You have one woman in the boat and the rest are men.
Saying
Um,
this reflects the reality, or is it?
well, I think it's more women do take the risk, but I think it's a lot more arduous for women, and they face a lot more violence in the trajectory to get there. But the case is made always, "Well, why are you going?" Because you have it okay here. Like, you could make a life. And these young men in the Senegalese context, there's one that tells them it's not worth it. You don't need to go. You can make it here. Yet there's still this and we have this problem in the United States too with immigrants, risking their lives on the border, our southern borders, to get to this country because it's that myth that everything is paved in gold and that you can make a better life for yourself economically. And we know that 9 times out of 10, this is just not the case, right? And people die trying to achieve that myth. And they're
Yeah.
kind of the idea in these films is that you're doomed before you begin because that reality is just, false. Um,
Yeah.
so that's what we see in this film in the boat by in from 2012. And then we have even we could go back in time to La Noire de Black Girl, which came out in 1966, and it was one of Sim Ben Usman's first feature-length films, and already in 1966, it's on that subject of why go to Europe instead, when you could stay here and try to invest in your own country and become something, um,
But that's
and
the
all those.
message that.
Sorry?
So that's the message that you think is like common in some of these films about clandestine migration is, you know, the point is to retain people. Is that the message, or is there maybe multiplicity?
I think it is. I mean, I from all the films that I include in this course, and then a lot of films that I've written on, that's one of the defining messages, and I think filmmakers are trying to say, "Look, I mean, we have a brain drain in Africa.
Hmm.
Uh, we're losing our" and the thing is, they also make the point of showing that not just poverty is the driving factor for people to get in a boat and cross and risk their lives to cross over to Europe. Um, a lot of the people who, and I'm thinking of the Algerian film, Araga by, Mirzak Alouache, which came out in 2010. That's they're young people with educations, and yet they still think it would be better for them to get in a boat, risk their lives, and go and get to Spain. Um, so film has been very important, I think, in getting the message out that, this is risky and this is dangerous, and you should think twice about embarking on it. There are many, many novels that have been written on this subject too. But I find the films are just so much better at transmitting to larger audiences the um, the tragic outcomes that are possible, by thinking you're gonna make it to Europe.
Yeah, you mentioned brain drain as an issue. And I mean, Africa is growing economically, but it continues to have the lowest average per capita incomes in the world. And the cultural industry can be a very promising source of economic growth. You mentioned Nollywood as well, Nigeria's film industry, which is estimated to be worth billions of dollars, employing over a million people. So, how do you see that maybe African countries can effectively tap into this vast pool of wealth? How can African countries in different regions use this industry to grow their economy, to own their image, and sort of rise and compete globally with other film industries?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and, I've studied that, and the way these industries evolve, and are evolving, again, is very, dictated to by their former colonial, you know, um, the former colonial context. For
Mhm.
example, the reason why Nollywood and Nigerian videos, have done so well is because of, Britain's former colonial, setup as far as media goes. And, for example, in former British colonies, television was so much more, invested in than film. Film was not, whereas in the French context, so I'm talking about North Africa and West Africa particularly, um, the film industry there's always been this view that film's like the 7e art, it's an art form. So, film is very, much a cultural signifier and, way of emitting a sort of cultural refinement, and so the way that, post-colonial cinematic industries were set up really were defined by these former colonial ties. So in the British colonies, former colonies, television, much more, the thing, serials, much more the thing, um, and
Documentaries,
sorry?
documentaries as well, are sort of
Documentary, yeah, and so we don't have this kind of cultivation of the art form that you have, for example, in Morocco. I mean, in Morocco is a good case study because the CCM set up was just really just set up in 58, t on the French model, of course, and then it just kind of stayed in this, kind of French box of I wanna say a view of film, was kind of transmitted that way even now, and you have a lot of course, younger filmmakers in Morocco saying, "The heck with that, I'm not doing anything with this ASAM, I'm going out on my own," and that I find is um, a refreshing trend. And of course, thanks to YouTube and these kind of, streaming platforms, there's less need for these kind of old stodgy French models of making films. Um, and the Anglophone countries basically just bypassed all that sort of cultural model things, and I think Nollywood has been also good for that in that it showed younger generations of filmmakers, "Oh, I don't need this kind of, stodgy old way of thinking about film. I'm going to just forge out on my own and do my own thing and mass produce my work, and it doesn't have to be perfect lighting or perfect equipment because that in the end, we see how these Nollywood, series are consumed, I mean, it's the Nigerian communities here are very they get the latest Nollywood films. Why? Because everything goes over, the internet or goes through, YouTube. So, the diaspora, um, is much more included, I think, in the film production. of these films because they are, let's face it, I mean, certainly for Nigeria, there's just this huge potential to consume the product, right? And I think
There's
more and more this is going I mean, countries are gonna have to figure out how to monetize this, especially the formerly French colonial modeled ones, because, it could be a huge it could be a huge moneymaker, yeah, for the continent.
So, you mentioned that the Moroccan cinema switched from the post-colonial context, and today, after young people started to create cinema in their own way. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of Nadir Boumouche. He makes these amazing, documentaries, and and they're very socially activist. And I think he tells stories that need to be told, I think I mean, Morocco's very interesting because I've always said that even the most sort of stylized film is still very much a documentary about something. And I've been working on Fawzi bin Saidi. So, he did Mille Mois, which is an iconic film in, I guess, the 2000s. If you look at Moroccan filmmaking in the 2000s, and this film came out in 2003. And it's very much, although it tells a narrative, it's very much a documentary about, being cut off from, urban centers and, the challenges that, climate and just being,
Yeah.
confined to a small village in the desert, What does that mean, in the sense of human agency and this kind of thing? So, even the most recent filmmakers, I still find are still kind of at least in Morocco, going back to, are not deviating from the sort of mission to tell a story, but also change the mindset of the powers that be, you know?
Yeah. Um, well, finally, on a hopeful note, we've covered the politics, the economics, and the art. Uh, how do you think accurate knowledge about migration and cinema for all parties involved can help change the tides of despair that you mentioned in those trajectories? And how can cinema change our discourse and our political decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I always say I wish, politicians would look at the humanities. I mean, not even but not only film, but, literature, the arts, um, because it's there where you find, I think, the truth or how people are telling stories and how truthful they are, and how much they need to be heard. I mean, this is why, for example, we're under attack. I mean, because the officials that be do not want the stories that we're telling because they are the truth. Um, and my hope is that we can just weather the backlash that seems to be everywhere these days, against the truth the truth coming out, but I think film and literature are the necessary ways of transmitting to audiences and readers, social messages, socio-political and economic message. Because you can write all the economic reports you want. You can, for example, do activism through an NGO, which is wonderful. But how many people are you really, you know,
Attracting.
attracting and going to be able to have a discourse with. Whereas film and literature and even the visual arts, I mean, those can go places that a report can't. Um, and that's why people in the humanities are so important. And I think that, and this is why they are viewed as so dangerous too, right now. So, I hope that we can just keep on producing and, and trying to find our way, and keep doing what we've been doing. So, I mean, I don't think we have the luxury, like this filmmaker in Morocco told me, to make films for le divertissement, we just can't do that. We have to keep having films that make people have conversations.
Absolutely. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about how films reveal some of these truths, and are able to capture in a way that is more accessible for people. What do you think for you, maybe the top films that have that perfectly capture different parts of Africa, and especially the differences between different countries and different regions?
Wow. Well, in the context of immigration films, I would say there's this film from 2002 um, by um, Mustafa Dejadam, and he's Algerian. And he only, as far as I know, made 2 films, and I've never been able to find any information much more on him. But this particular film called Frontières and Borders is about, clandestine immigration and really at the early 2000s. So, uh, you know, uh, he was really at the beginning, I guess, of the wave of this kind of immigrant story, being told. And it's about, 4 or 5, sub-Saharan African men going up through, to get to Morocco and then to get the boat to go across to Spain. And what's interesting, I love teaching it because it shows the colonial legacy. So the men who speak French are better able to negotiate how they get through different countries up to Morocco. And even in Morocco, when they're there, they have to find work and this kind of thing. Whereas the one guy who's from Liberia, they pick up on the way because they're going west up. He cannot speak French, and outside Liberia, he's, lost, like, and he ends up dying in the desert. So, there's, like, this context of language and the holdover of these colonial legacies that I think are very important to understand. And then also, the context of, well, sh once you get to Morocco and North Africa, there are certain racial paradigms that are put into place, and so, Mustafa Dejadam was or is Algerian, so he's talking about, the different racial, um, discourses that come out of sub-Saharan African immigration, and how these people do get stuck in North Africa because they can't get the boat or they can't, or then they're exploited so much they lose their money and then they're stuck in North Africa. They can't get back to their homeland. So that is also very interesting. And I thought I love to teach this film because it is one of the first films that really um, tackled all these different layers of human experience when you decide to can clandestinely immigrate somewhere. Um, and I think that linguistic one is very telling. At one point, um, one of the passeurs, the what do we call the cowboys, or they call them cowboys, that who who take the money to get the men to go in the boats and that kind of thing. And so at one point, one of these passeurs says, "Well, do you to the four men who come from all different countries, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, I think, and Mauritania." And he says, "Well, can you speak French?" And one guy says, "Oh yes, we're all sons of Charles de Gaulle." I
Mhm.
mean, so, he's really, Dejidam is really making a point about, even 60 years or so after colonialism, you're still relying on this, foreign colonial language to get you through your journey. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
in
guess
the
it's both
context of the
a
francophone countries, they do better than the anglophone.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I guess
Yeah.
it's both a blessing and a curse to have this kind of lingua franca. You can traverse different parts of the continent and be able to connect with people whom don't come from the same background as you, and you can still have a conversation because you have one sort of shared
Mhm.
language. But it's also interesting how the film was able to reveal some of the dynamics regarding, language politics or maybe even language ideology. So it's like a connection between migration and language and power dynamics. Thank you for
Totally,
sharing
totally.
those.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this for me has always in my work been French is a blessing and a curse because you do benefit from being able to make these amazing connections between, for example, authors and filmmakers who, from the former French colonies. And I mean, I'm blessed in the sense that, there are so many different contexts of writing in French still, because of this horrible colonial past. But then I'm also, of course, very conflicted about it because, well, why can't why does an author have to choose French to write in? Why can't he or she continue write in Wolof and, write in Darija? I mean, there are authors who do, and more we are seeing that, but the problem is you're, confined to whatever publication system you can, be integrated into so that you get your book published or whatever, whereas film has been much better because you can film in indigenous languages, and still get your film out there. I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of film that we don't have in literature. You can make a film in Darija, you can make a film in Wolof, and you will, of course, if you really wanna make money, you've gotta, get get it accessed by Europe or the United States. Unfortunately, the Western powers of media are still so much larger, but, I mean, at least you're getting your film out there, you're getting your message out there, um, and, I think, film festivals on the continent have become better organized at negotiating for filmmakers. Burkina Faso, the Burkina Festival, it's at Ouagadougou is every 2 years. I mean, it's been very, very good for filmmakers from all over the continent to at least have some kind of platform from which they can negotiate deals, with Europe to get their films, well, not produced, but, distributed.
Well, thank you very much for that. Before we conclude, do you have anything else you'd like to tell our audience, people who don't know much about African cinema, or maybe for those who do and want to be inspired to take some steps for the future to really bring this to light?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think today too, I mean, film is being challenged. I have to say with my students, it's hard to get them to watch an hour and a half film, you know? Last time I was in Morocco, I mentioned a whole list of amazing films, and none of the people in the audience had seen them, so I think one of the challenges will be for people to learn to get off of, TikTok for one thing, and to appreciate just going to a cinema too. I mean, that's another thing, we could talk about. I didn't touch upon that, but streaming platforms have been good and bad for cinema because, people don't go to theaters anymore. I mean, that's the case even here in the United States. So I think it's very sad when you can't go to a space for film and so that you're not distracted and, you turn off your phone and you're in that dark space totally captured by what you see on screen, and that's the beauty of cinema. A lot of that is being lost by social media platforms and just the brevity of what people wanna watch. They're being conditioned to watch less and less. So, the challenges of film, I think, will be to how to navigate, these new social media contexts.
African cinema has to compete as we increasingly immerse ourselves in the attention economy. Valerie, thank you very much for this illuminating discussion about the function of African cinema. I truly appreciate your insights. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And please stay tuned for next time to discuss African issues and continue our conversation on Africafé.
Thank you so much.